Hello, everybody. It's Ty Fischer, and I want to welcome you to our last episode in Season 3. The last new episode that we had was Doug Wilson's on helping your children prepare for controversy. And thank you for all the kind feedback on that one. But it made us want to go back and pick one episode to cap this season that's really been about courage, to make it the cap of that one. And that's our podcast with Robbie George. Now, I've been involved in some things that I'm pretty proud of, but the podcast that we have with Robbie George was one of those things that after I got done with it, kind of took the headset off and said, wow, man, that was really good. I kind of knew that we had something that I felt like would be not just really helpful to parents who are looking to train up students to have courage in the face of cancel culture, but just something that I felt like I learned a lot during the podcast listening to Robbie. So we wanted to go back and we wanted to focus on that as a kind of a capstone moment for this Season 3. We're in the midst of making recordings for Season 4 and looking forward to starting our new Season 4 with new episodes when the school year starts in September. So we'll be back to cultivating in the fall, which is a little bit weird to say in a sentence, but we will be releasing some of our greatest hits, re-releasing them over the summer. So if you need a dose of cultivate to make it through those hot months, there'll be a few episodes out there for you. But Season 4 is going to be coming up in September, and we'll look for a fruitful harvest then. So enjoy this episode on how to be courageous in the midst of cancel culture with Robbie George, who is a great exemplar of what he's going to be talking about today on the Cultivate podcast. I am here today. We're going to have a conversation with one of the top constitutional scholars in our country, Dr. Robert George, who is a professor at Princeton University. He has been a disciple maker, really, of so many people who have now become influential speakers and thinkers, especially as we see the political division in the country now. So he's the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton, and he's been the top intellectual proponent of traditional marriage during a time when someone needed to stand up and speak up for this traditional institution, which we've decided doesn't matter anymore. So he's written many books and been involved in that defense and in raising up people that would stand faithfully for the truth. So we're blessed to have him on today. I've known about Dr. George for years and was just thrilled last year that he was able to come and be our commencement speaker. The talk that he gave at that commencement was really moving to me, and I asked him if he would come back on the podcast and we could dig into that theme a little bit more. And the theme, I think the title to the talk was it Faith, Truth, and Courage, Dr. George?
Yes, it was something like that. I very much enjoyed my visit. It was wonderful to be able to contribute a little bit to the work of the academy, the work of the school, which I think is so profoundly important. But it was good to have the opportunity to come and deliver my message.
Well, we were very thankful for it. When you were here, you kind of used a starting point, or one of the things that you mentioned very early in your talk were a couple of talks delivered by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in 1978 and 1983. Now, why, number one, you were present at one of those talks, right?
I was. It was not my Harvard graduation, but it was a year before I graduated from Harvard. But I was there when Alexander Solzhenitsyn in 1978 came to Harvard to give the commencement address. I wasn't in the yard where the commencement is held, but I was just outside the walls, so I was able to listen to the address, which of course was over an amplification system and the translation. So it was a galvanizing moment. It must be said that the address was not entirely enthusiastically received. It was a criticism of the West and a criticism of Western progressivism or liberalism, including for its cowardice, as he charged. So it was a mixed reaction at the time. I thought he was right on the mark, but not everyone among the students and faculty agreed with me about that.
Yeah. There was probably somebody who had to have some intense meetings afterward about vetting speakers or something like that.
Yeah, that's right.
But why did you take those two talks? And if you want to just give us a little bit of what the content of the talks were, why did you take those two talks as a jumping off point to talk about faith and courage?
Well, I think faith and courage are the essential ingredients for the renewal and reform of our very, very badly decayed culture and civic order right now. We need faith and we need courage. We need some other things as well, but faith and courage are really very central. So I wanted to exhort the students to keep the faith and build up the virtue of courage, practice the virtue of courage. And I wanted to deliver that message to teachers and to parents and grandparents as well. And of course, it was exactly Solzhenitsyn's message to the students and faculty of Harvard in 1978. Let's think back to 1978. We were in the wake of the catastrophe, the American defeat, frankly, in the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Anti-Americanism was rife not only in other countries in the world, not only including the West, but even including the United States of America. Mm-hmm. Americans had lost faith in the goodness of their own country. And the Soviets, right in the heart of the Cold War, in the heat of the Cold War, of course, were hugely advantaged by this American loss of faith and with it a loss of courage. But to confront the challenge represented by Soviet imperialism, the Soviets were on the march. Now, fortunately, in addition to Solzhenitsyn himself calling out the cowardice of the West, calling out the West's loss of faith in its own institutions, in the foundations, the philosophical and theological foundations of its own way of life and its own civic order. In addition to Solzhenitsyn calling it out, fortunately, we had three people who emerged right about the same time in leadership roles who did have the faith and courage and were willing to confront the Soviets and eventually defeated them. And of course, that was Margaret Thatcher in England, Ronald Reagan in the United States, and Pope John Paul II.
I got two of the three right off the bat, but you're right that John Paul II was just such an important part of standing up for truth and standing up to communism. That was, of course, and he had seen that as a priest in Poland.
He had, and it was his visit shortly after being elected to the chair of St. Peter. It was his visit to Poland which galvanized the Solidarity movement, which brought down the Polish communist puppet regime, leading to the fall of the dominoes and the collapse of the Soviet Empire. That is why the very elderly and frail Margaret Thatcher, when Pope John Paul II himself, who had been very elderly and frail by then, died, Margaret Thatcher, who could barely leave her own home at the time, made the arduous for her visit to Rome to be there for the Pope's funeral, to pay tribute to the Pope for the critical role he had played in bringing down communism in Europe.
Wow, I did not remember that. That's a wonderful part of the story. So
that was the first address. That was the 1978 address. The 1983 address was Solzhenitsyn's address upon receiving the Templeton Prize. Of course, the Templeton Prize is an internationally acclaimed award for, to put it in the words of John Templeton, the founder, Sir John Templeton, progress in the field of religion. Solzhenitsyn was not a priest, but he was a deeply religious man, a deeply religious Russian Orthodox Christian. And he, in that speech, linked the collapse of faith in the West, and especially in the United States, faith in our civic institutions and our philosophical and moral principles to the loss of faith in God. Echoing Abraham Lincoln, Solzhenitsyn told his audience and the world that the fundamental problem for us today is we have forgotten God. We regard ourselves as being little gods. We've fallen victim to the cult of the imperial self. This was in the highlight of heyday, I should say, of the so-called me generation. And Solzhenitsyn linked that loss of faith in God, this worship of the self, to the collapse of faith in our institutions and principles.
Yeah. No, he wasn't a priest. He was a prophet, I think.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. That's right. As in his own way was Lincoln. You might remember, Ty, in the talk that I gave at the Academy, I referred to two men with craggy faces and beards who served us as prophets in our history. And of course, one was Abraham Lincoln, the other was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And their message was exactly the same. If you look at Lincoln's proclamation of a day of thanksgiving and prayer and repentance from 1863, a national proclamation of thanksgiving to God and prayer and repentance, you will find Lincoln boldly, clearly, unequivocally stating that the problem with our country, what had led to the collapse into civil war, was that men have forgotten God. And it's exactly what Solzhenitsyn said in 1983.
Wow.
Prophets' messages are usually the same message, and it boils down to we have forgotten God. We're trying to do it on our own, without God's help, without God's grace, without a due gratitude to God. We're focused on ourselves. We're worshiping ourselves, and in the process, ruining ourselves.
That's right. That's right. So that's why there were a few people in the audience that we don't usually have like amening or groaning during our convocation. Well, sometimes groaning if it goes on for too long. But
I hope I didn't do that.
No, you did not. You did not. But you just struck a chord when you started with Solzhenitsyn. But in thinking about, like, you have to practice courage every day. I mean, we're in the midst of a cancel culture, and maybe some of the hottest beds of cancel culture are Ivy League institutions. And you're there arguing. You're one of the I think the top advocate for traditional marriage. Well, how did you develop that kind of courage, and how do you help others find that kind of courage at Princeton, both students and teachers?
Well, I don't really have a very good answer for the first question, so let me answer the second one first, and then we'll go back and wrestle a bit with the first one. What I try to do, and what I encourage other faculty to do, is to model the attitudes and conduct that we want to see in our students. If we want to see in our students, as we should, as I certainly do, determined truth-seeking and bold truth-speaking, then we had better model that ourselves. We need to show our students. We need to teach them by precept and example, and the example is the example of being determined truth-seekers and bold truth-speakers. I succeed to the extent that I do succeed, and I'm a frail and fallen, infallible person, and I don't always get it right. But where I have succeeded with my students, it is by modeling for them a determination to get at the truth and a bold willingness to speak the truth as God gives me to understand the truth. Now, that modeling is the key, I think. Now, let's go back to your first question, and here I don't have an answer. I arrived at Princeton in the fall of 1985, just out of graduate school. I'd done my law degree at Harvard and then my doctorate in philosophy of law at Oxford University. So Princeton wasn't very different from the institutions at which I had studied. So I knew the ethos and I knew the drill. But I arrived as a pro-life, pro-marriage, pro-traditional morality conservative, to use the label that attaches to those beliefs these days, and I didn't hide that. I didn't feel any compulsion to hide it. I knew that it was the minority view by far on campus at Princeton, as it had been at Oxford and at Harvard. I knew that there were some people who would hold that against me and might make it a bit more difficult for me to succeed professionally in my work as a scholar and teacher, to get tenure, for example, to advance in terms of my career. But for some reason, Ty, just wasn't afraid. I didn't fear it. I spoke my mind from the moment I walked in the door, and I encourage students to do likewise. Now, I have noticed this over the years with my students, and there are really two categories, and it's people in the second category who deserve the highest praise. Category one are students like myself who just don't seem to feel the fear. They know that there are dangers, but they just don't feel the fear. It doesn't grab them. It doesn't paralyze them. Fortunately, I was like that by the grace of God. An example of one of my students who's very much like that is Ryan Anderson. Ryan's an outspoken public intellectual, great defender of the sanctity of human life and marriage as a conjugal union of husband and wife. I'm very proud of him. He's currently president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and is just such a force for good in our intellectual and broader culture. Well, Ryan is like me. He doesn't feel the fear. He speaks his mind boldly and just moves ahead.
His books disappear off of Amazon mysteriously.
Yeah, that's right. His book critiquing the whole transgender phenomenon and ideology was banned by Amazon. But none of that stops him. He is unflappable. He's bold, and he doesn't feel the fear. And he deserves praise. He deserves praise for that. But the people who deserve even more praise is this second category of students I've noticed. And here I won't single out an individual by name, but I could if you put me on the spot to do it. These are people who feel the fear, even feel it deeply, and yet out of conviction, out of the understanding that God has called them to be bold truth speakers, nevertheless, despite the fear, speak the truth and speak it boldly. It's hard for them, harder than it is for someone like me or someone like Ryan. It's really hard for them, and yet they do it anyway. Those are the people, Ty, who deserve the highest praise. I have just the greatest admiration for them.
Yeah.
They deserve a lot more praise than I deserve.
Well, when we think about young people especially, you talked about the cult of the divine self. So you would think that if everyone is kind of a little God walking around, that everyone would be bold and no one would be conformist and no one would be frightened, but it turns out they are. What do you think are the forces that innervate that kind of courage or weaken that kind of courage in the lives of young people today?
Well, of course, Ty, courage is a virtue that's always in short supply. Always and everywhere there aren't enough courageous people. Cowardice is more abundant. So we're not fundamentally different today than people have been throughout history. Not fundamentally, but still, courage is among the main virtues that we are critically missing and need to recover if we're to renew and restore and reform and save this culture and this civic order. I tell my students that I've got good news and bad news. The good news is courage is contagious. That modeling phenomenon we were talking about is really important because if people see courage exemplified, they see the nobility of it. And it empowers them. It makes them want to be like that. And so if you model courage for other people, you will find that it is contagious, that people who had been holding back, even cowering in fear, will suddenly feel a bit more comfortable, a bit more willing to step out and perform some courageous deeds, speak courageously some unpopular truths. Again, the modeling is so critical. Now, I said there's good news and bad news. I tell my students there's good news and bad news. You know what the bad news is? Well, you can guess it. Cowardice is contagious too.
Yeah.
When people see other people cowering, when they see them being cowardly, well, the temptation is to be like them. So if we want to change things for the better, if we want renewal and reform, if we want to make this great experiment in morally ordered liberty and constitutional government long endure, to quote Lincoln again, long endure, then we're going to have to model that courage.
Yeah.
There's no alternative to it, and we need to call on our young people to be their best. Now, why is it a problem? That was your question, really, Ty.
Yeah.
It's a problem because we human beings like comfort. We don't like to be made outsiders. We don't like to be outcasts. We like to fit in. It's our nature. We're naturally social creatures. We want other people's approval. We want to be thought well of. We want to be thought to be sophisticated. We want to be thought to be in the in crowd. That's natural. That's human nature, and it's not entirely bad. I'm glad man has a social nature. I'm glad we're not atomistic individuals.
Yeah,
but this is the dark side or downside of it.
We experimented with that during COVID, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. No, not great.
No, it's not.
It's not great for human beings. It's not what our nature really demands. So we should understand that, and we should be compassionate in dealing with people who are having trouble mustering the courage because they're afraid not to fit in. They're afraid to be attacked on social media. They're afraid to be singled out for a program. They're afraid not to fit in, especially young people. Young people have an entirely undeserved reputation for being free thinkers and rebels. Young people are the least rebellious and free-thinking people in the world, and you can test that with an easy little thought experiment. If you've got a 15 or 16-year-old son or daughter in your house, just think about how that person feels. That young kid feels if suddenly they're out and realize that they are in the wrong sneakers, that the sneakers they're wearing are not the up-to-date fashionable thinker sneakers. Terror strikes their hearts because young people are natural conformists. And of course, our job as teachers and as parents is actually to move them from conformist ways of thinking to being people who will, in fact, think for themselves. Because unless people think for themselves, they're never going to be determined truth seekers and courageous truth speakers. We need to get them to think for themselves. And that means we don't do their thinking for them either, but we encourage them to think for themselves.
Yeah. When I was in thinking back to church history, especially, I was in Rome a number of years ago, and I had read a few books in preparation for the trip, and one of them was a book called The Geometry of Love. It's about the architecture of a church called St. Agnes outside the walls. And the church actually grew up from the catacombs, from around the tomb of St. Agnes, a 12-year-old Roman girl who was killed, was martyred.
Yeah, she was a martyr.
Faith. Yeah. So unfortunately, when I went there, all of the tour guides were on lunch break, and I only got to see the outside of the church, so I have to go back to Rome now. So, but it was interesting once I came into contact with that, as I was around Rome and some of the other cities, it was not unusual for young people to be the ones standing up for their faith and facing not just like social media pressure, but lions, tigers, bears, and Roman swords. So, when we try to, I do have a 15 or 16-year-old, and you nailed it with the sneaker thing. As parents, though, as we're trying to convey that sense of courage, again, is modeling, you think, the most important thing, or are there other elements or other things that we should be doing?
Well, of course, the other thing that's critically important is nurturing their faith, making sure that they have a rich and not simply superficial faith. When young people have been willing to be bold truth speakers, as St. Agnes was, it's that there's no question what the foundation of that is. It's a rich, deep, mature, even for their tender years, faith. And that's going to be true for all of us throughout life. I mean, it's hard to exemplify the virtue of courage if you don't have faith, and it's a lot easier to do it if you do have faith. Now, it's never easy, but it's going to be a lot easier if you have faith. I mean, think about the apostles. Think about the apostles in that upper room, cowering in fear. Jesus had been crucified. The whole thing had come crashing down, and Jesus appears among them. And one of the things he says is, "Be not afraid. Be not afraid." It's Jesus who gives them courage. It's Jesus who gives us courage. At least that's what we Christians believe. It's Jesus that gives us that courage. If we rely on him, we can do it.
Yeah.
And think of the apostles before Pentecost, right? They're afraid. They're terrified. They know that they're in grave danger of life and limb, no question about it. But when the Holy Spirit descends on them, they get the grace of God. They are able to proclaim the gospel
Yeah.
boldly.
You
They
know,
become bold truth speakers.
yeah. And being that bold truth speaker, really, I think it was Rene Girard who connected the actions of the apostles to, and they faced death continually, and almost all of them, died as martyrs. But that's okay when you've seen a dead man walking around. When you've seen someone who's come back from the dead, you're not quite as scared of it anymore. So, I mean, if our faith in the resurrection is real, that means that we are freed to play the game of this life very differently. So,
no question about that. As you say, all of them were martyred. The only one who wasn't martyred was St. John,
right.
the apostle who Jesus
He
loved.
got tossed in oil once, though, didn't he?
Yeah, that's right. It wasn't easy even for him.
Yeah.
But he was the one, interestingly, the one who wasn't martyred was also the most courageous one of all. When all the other apostles fled, who was the only apostle who stood at the foot of the cross with the holy women, Jesus' mother and the others? It was St. John. The kid, the young one, the apostle who Jesus loved. And it was to St. John that Jesus said from the cross, "Son, behold thy mother." And then to his mother, indicating John, "Mother, behold thy son," giving Mary to all of us as mother. John is the symbol here of the Christian faithful, of the faithful person who stands at the foot of the cross, as we all must do. So there's tremendous rich symbolism in the gospel, all pointing to these essential truths we've been talking about.
Yeah. Well, I think about the Lewis, the Abolition of Man, talking about men without chests, and then we see those kinds of men in Lewis's That Hideous Strength, who use collective power and the trappings of science, and they do that, the manipulative force of an inner circle, basically to keep a husband from protecting a wife.
Yeah.
How can we particularly challenge, one of the biggest areas where it's been the area of kind of sexuality. So how can we foster the kind of, I was in middle school. I know that it took some courage to go ask a girl to dance at a middle school dance, but how can we re-energize the courage to be men and women and to enjoy being men and women? The best thing about my wife is not that she's exactly like me. It's like it's that there is both similarity, but then there's glorious difference too. So how can we help young men and women really enjoy the fullness of life in their bodies and then as families?
Well, there's a lot here to talk about. Of course, I've tried to address it in some of my own
You could quote
writings.
You could quote John Paul II's Theology of the Body if you want. So,
well, I actually have my own take on these things. Not exactly like John Paul's. We reach exactly the same conclusions in pretty much down the line, actually. Yeah, but his philosophical tradition is the personalist one and the phenomenological one, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in that tradition. So if you look at the roots of his thinking, he was a philosophy professor, of course. You find them in figures like Edmund Husserl, a great German phenomenologist, and Husserl's student Max Scheler, for example. Mine are more in the tradition that really begins with Plato and especially Aristotle, and goes up through St. Thomas Aquinas and forward from there. So our approaches philosophically, methodologically are a bit different. I've got great respect for his and for his tradition. And I've read Husserl and Scheler and John Paul II with great profit, especially John Paul II's book, The Acting Person, which I think is a genuine philosophical achievement. That's a book he wrote while he was a professor in Poland before he became Pope. My work, especially in the area of sexual morality, for anybody who would like to see how I tackle these questions and address some of the questions you just raised, my work is probably best accessed in a book that I wrote with Ryan Anderson and another of my former students, Sharif Girgis, called "What Is Marriage? Man and Woman a Defense."
Mm-hmm.
That's now out in a second edition, and then, of course, that addresses directly why it's man and woman, that men and women are not interchangeable, that our biological realities, our bodily reality, really does matter, and that sexual reproductive complementarity is the key to understanding sexual morality, and certainly the key to understanding why we have such a thing as an institution of marriage,
Mm-hmm.
and the good that that institution embodies and represents. So I'd encourage anybody who wants to see how I develop the case there to have a look at that book. I have some other writings as well. The sort of more academic version of my arguments is presented in a book by Cambridge University Press that I've written with a colleague named Patrick Lee, and that book's called Conjugal Union, and the subtitle is What Marriage Is and Why It Matters. Again, the title is Conjugal Union. What you were pointing to at the beginning of your last question, I think what you have in mind is the ideology that people have started referring to these days as woke ideology.
Yeah.
And I think at the heart of woke ideology and what distinguishes it from Jewish and Christian thought, certainly, and from other great traditions of thought, East and West, is that central to it is a certain philosophical anthropology. That's just a fancy phrase, a fancy label for a view of the human, a view of human nature, the human good, human dignity, human destiny. There's a certain view of humanity there, and it identifies the human, it identifies the self with one's feelings, desires, emotions, sentiments, and so forth. So what am I? I'm a bundle of feelings, desires, emotions. Yes, I'm rational. I'm different from a lion or tiger or bear, and different, obviously, from an ant or a slug. But that rationality, that rational aspect of man, simply plays an instrumental role in enabling me to figure out the ways to gratify, satisfy, appease my desires, my feelings, my emotions, my wants. It's the identification of the person with feeling and desire that's the key to understanding woke ideology.
Yeah.
Now, notice how profoundly different this is from the Christian understanding of the human person, and indeed from the classical Greek and Roman understanding of the human person, at least as exemplified in the thought of the great thinkers of Greece and Rome, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, people like this, whose insights were taken up into Christianity. There's a certain sense in which Christianity represents the coming together of Athens and Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Jerusalem obviously is the Hebrew Bible, the great revelation to the Jews that Christians call the Old Testament. And of course, Athens represents the thought of figures like Plato and Aristotle. We can broaden that to include some of the great Roman thinkers as well.
You're going to get Tertullian to drop the podcast here, Dr. George, because that church father said that what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Like he was.
Yeah, that's right.
And actually, here at Veritas, there are two rooms, Athens and Jerusalem, and they're right down the hallway from each other. So I was trying to make a little joke on Tertullian there.
Well, very good. That's right.
He'll hit me with a stick in heaven, I guess.
Well, you notice he's not Saint Tertullian, right?
Yeah, there you go. You Catholics backed off of him there, right?
So I think it's really critical to understand this. So we Christians, in line with the thinking of the great classical pagan thinkers, the thinkers of antiquity, we Christians do not identify the self with our feelings and desires and wants and emotions. We don't disdain them. We don't think they're intrinsically bad, but we understand that they have to be put under the control of reason and faith, that they do not tell us what is good, what we should want. We need reason and faith to identify what is good, what we should want, and we should then bring our emotions into line with what is truly good, our judgments as to what is truly good, judgments informed by what, again, John Paul II called the two wings on which the human spirit ascends to contemplation of the truth, faith and reason. For a Christian and for a Jew and for a follower of Plato or Aristotle, the great challenge of a human life is to become master of oneself by putting one's rationality in control in the role of governing one's appetites, one's feelings, one's desires. So it's the opposite of identifying the self with the feelings and desires. It's a theory, rather, or an ethics of self-mastery.
Yeah.
We Christians, we don't think, I should do whatever I feel like doing, or that my feelings define who I am. I need a critical perspective on those feelings, and I need to change or alter those feelings if they're out of line with what is truly good, what is truly wantable, what I have intelligible, basic reasons for wanting.
Sure. Just to make sure that what you're saying there is so important, because what our culture is telling children today is that the most real thing about them is their desires. Those desires are more real than their bodies. They're more real than nature. They're more real than the authority structure and the people around them who love them, who are trying to shape them. What's really the most real is what I feel in my heart. And that is, anyone who's been around a child for any degree of time knows that's the one thing they should not be listening to. I mean, that's the one thing that changes every 6 minutes. And we're telling them, whether you're a man or a woman, a boy or a girl, that's how you feel in your heart. And the pressure, it's not, when you think about it in this kind of rubric, it's not shocking that kids are much more clinically anxious or clinically depressed than they were just a few years ago. That's a hard weight to bear, to think
Absolutely.
that your feelings have that kind of power. I mean, Milton back in Paradise Lost said, the mind is its own place and in itself can make a hell of heaven and a heaven of hell. But that was Satan. That was Satan. Yeah. Satan was saying that. But we're telling kids in our culture, yeah, that's it. That's it. Your mind can just make reality. And my fear for them is that nature just keeps on knocking on the door, and that someday they wake up and they realize, my goodness, I am not my feelings. I'm much more complicated than that. I'm embodied, and that body is that body and soul is me. So it's been interesting. There was one other thing I wanted to just make sure. I want our listeners to have reasons to pray for people. And some of the work that you're doing, tell us a little bit about the James Madison Institute. And then you were talking about how courage is courageous, and what you're doing at the James Madison Institute, and then thinking strategically about how to plant that seed across some of the top colleges in our land. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I founded at Princeton the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions back in 2000. I, a year earlier, had the good fortune of being named to one of the university's most celebrated endowed chairs called the McCormick Professorship in Jurisprudence. And that prompted me to think, well, I can probably build something with this new role that I have on campus. So I went to the administration, having raised a bit of money, with a proposal to establish a new program in moral and political thought and constitutional law, which would build on Princeton's historic strengths in these fields, in public law and jurisprudence, as we call it, going all the way back into the 19th century when Woodrow Wilson was the first McCormick Professor of jurisprudence.
You sit in Woodrow Wilson's seat.
Yes, I do. Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah,
My that was the most joyful thing that I've thought today.
So the administration warmly received my proposal. We worked it out and established the Madison program. Went into business July 4th, 2000, the millennial year 2000, on Independence Day. So we've been going for 22 years. We've just entered our 23rd year with the new academic year that's just beginning. And our goal is to help our young men and women to understand deeply, and we hope appreciate deeply, the basic principles of this grand experiment bequeathed to us by our founding fathers in morally ordered liberty and republican government. We understand that in order for this experiment to continue, in order for Republican government and morally ordered liberty to long endure, as I quoted Lincoln saying earlier, it requires an educated citizenry. James Madison, go all the way back to the beginning. James Madison, who's regarded as the father, the architect of the Constitution, famously said, only a well-instructed people can be permanently a free people.
Yes.
Now, why did he say that? Having constructed this beautiful Constitution, why didn't he think, oh, well, we got this great Constitution. We have this great system. It's got all these structural constraints on power. We've added a Bill of Rights. Why should we worry about whether the people are well educated or not? The Constitution will take care of them. It's because Madison understood that having the words on the page, the so-called parchment guarantees, were only a necessary, not a sufficient condition for the survival of morally ordered liberty and Republican government.
Yep.
To make it work, you need not only the mechanics, you need not only the sort of hardware, but you need the software as well. People need to understand their Constitution, understand how it works, understand how to protect it, understand the importance of living by its norms, understand the importance of holding politicians to account when they violate its norms. So we wanted to supply in the Madison program the other portion of what's needed to preserve liberty and prevent tyranny, and that is a well-instructed citizenry. And we were blessed at Princeton to have these extraordinary students. I mean, they are amazing. I've now taught for 37 years, and I'm just astonished every year at how brilliant our students are, and how, and in many cases, how deeply they want to learn, how they want to lead good lives, how open they are to instruction. Obviously, many of them come already sort of indoctrinated into the prominent dogmas of the contemporary ideology, but a lot of them even then are open to challenge, open to critique, open to being truly educated. They don't want to be just indoctrinated. And so the Madison program has really flourished. We've grown so big and strong and influential at Princeton. We typically have about 240 or so undergraduate fellows in the Madison program who participate very regularly and extensively in the life of our program, take our courses, attend our conferences, attend our guest lectures. We just had a wonderful lecture last night from Judge Amul Thapar of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, defending the interpretative philosophy of constitutional law called originalism, famously associated with the late Justice Scalia.
Yeah.
So it's just been a huge success. So shortly after it became clear in the 2000 aughts that this thing was going to work and be a big success, people began asking, well, can we do it elsewhere? Is it possible to build these institutions elsewhere? And we began to see other programs at other universities modeled on the Madison program, including not only at private universities like Princeton, but also at some public universities. Then in 2014, together with my collaborator, Luis Tellez, president of the Witherspoon Institute here in Princeton, who had been among the founders of the Madison program, worked closely with me in founding the Madison program, we established something called the Foundation for Excellence in Higher Education with the specific mission of being the Johnny Appleseed that would plant new programs and institutes modeled on the Madison program and on the Witherspoon Institute, also in Princeton, as I say, at universities around the country. And we now have 26 such institutes and programs at 14 leading universities. For example, at Harvard, Johns Hopkins, University of Pennsylvania, University of Chicago, Oxford University. That's the one we have abroad, is at Oxford University. And they are flourishing. There is a hunger out there among our students for genuine, high quality, challenging civic education.
Yeah.
And we just need to meet the need. The demand is there. We need to supply the need.
And I remember when you were here, you said, if you can just get the right 7 schools in America to do something, everyone else copies it because they think that they want to do whatever those schools do. That was, they kowtow to those 7 institutions. So, well,
you are not suggesting, Ty, and you're not suggesting that I was suggesting that academic people or academic institutions fall into conformism and groupthink. You're not suggesting that. No. We wouldn't suggest that for a moment, that they just do what other people do.
Well, I can just tell you that if we could get Socrates back alive again, I don't think he would last long in these institutions that were basically...
Some things don't change.
Yeah. The hemlock's on the menu still. So,
I'm afraid.
Well, Dr. George, thank you for all all you're doing. And I would just encourage people to keep things like the Madison Institute and all of its attendant or other started institutes at other places. Just keep those in your prayers. Those are an important part of accomplishing what we're trying to accomplish in K-12 at classical Christian schools. We're trying to raise up a generation that loves truth and that has the courage to speak to it. And Dr. George, thank you so much for this conversation and for being one of those people who gives courage to a lot of people in the boldness that you have speaking up for truth.
Thank you, Ty. It's a pleasure to talk with you, and I look forward to seeing you again sometime. I hope soon.
I hope so too.
You've been listening to Cultivate, the podcast of Veritas Academy, a preschool through 12th grade classical Christian school in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. If you'd like to learn more about Veritas, visit veritasacademy.com to discover the truth, beauty, and goodness of classical Christian education.